Hello everyone and welcome to this national webinar on democracy in India since independence. The Department of Political Science, TC College, is delighted to host a webinar of this kind. Well, I'm Smita Gore and I will be your host for this event. So once again, I welcome one and all. Ladies and gentlemen, we all know that our country is the world's largest democracy. It's the only country in Asia that has remained democratic ever since it attained its independence from the British rule, and many were apprehensive of the success of democracy in India. In today's webinar, we are going to have deliberations on all the issues related to democracy. That is, how India became a democracy, how India changed since independence, whether democracy is under threat, and the current situation of democracy in India. Today's democracy is a convergence of participants from Delhi, Punjab, Madhya Pradesh, Kerala, and Maharashtra, and they will be sharing their thoughts on democracy since independence. And now, without further ado, I turn the time to Dr. Murungar, our principal and convener of this webinar, to welcome the dignitaries. So, over to you, sir. Thank you.
Good morning. I am very much happy that Department of Political Science is organizing a national webinar on democracy in India since independence. On this occasion, I must congratulate Honorable Dr. Hanuman Phatak sir, who is the head and coordinator of this activity, and also Dr. Rajiv Pandey, who is the coordinator for the whole program. Dear friends, I am very much happy that this 3-day national seminar is going to give us a new view, a new idea, and also remembering the new avenues of the history in Indian democracy. I am very much happy that Hanuman Phatak sir has taken a lot of pains to bring the galaxy of resource persons to narrate and to address this very important national webinar. To mention few, we have got with us Dr. Mangesh Kulkarni, Dr. Suja Shakir, Dr. Chaitra Redkar, Dr. Harish Wankhede, Dr. Bishwajit Prakash, Dr. Shiv Kumar, Dr. Renu Rai, Dr. Sharad Baviskar, Dr. Pramod Pawar, Dr. Vilas Avre, Dr. Dattatray Wable, Dr. Naushalidi Ali, Dr. Prashant Vighe, and obviously a good friend of mine, Dr. Bal Kamble. Dear friends, we do know that after 70 years of independence, a time has come to look back and redefine the Indian democracy. Yes, the world has divided into several sectors, but the world is remembering India for its healthy democracy since its inception. We, in the post-independent era, have witnessed several changes, amalgamations, and new approaches with which the democracy has become more and more stronger, and also it has shown its impact on several fields in social sciences. Definitely, in times to come, Indian democracy has taken several turns, the uphills and downhills in its implementation. To name some, We do know that secularism has been added and being implemented as a part and component of Indian democracy. Dear friends, the Indian democracy can be redefined as a democratic freedom which has been created by the people, for the people, and at the action of the people. But when we talk about the democracy, we do know that this democracy stands on three strong feet. Obviously, the first feet obviously is nothing but a parliamentary component wherein the selected and the parliamentary components, they are playing a greater role to formulate the rules and regulations. Obviously, we have got a very strong administrative role which has been played by the IS officers, and definitely we have got again an independent jurisdictory system which is implementing the nooks and cons and also finding the new path with corrections for this independent India. Definitely, when we talk about the Indian democracy, there is a lot to be done more. The lot changes are to be done more, and we have to see that the healthy democracy must sustain at the end of every action, every constraint, every obstacle if it is supposed to come. And because of that, I feel that such a type of national seminar and webinar with a galaxy of resource persons is going to give us a new way, new approach of roadmap with which we have to redefine, reshape, reorient, and obviously reunite the form of Indian democracy, which can be an ideal democracy in the world days to come. Yes, this churning interaction in this national political webinar will be a milestone in the Department of Political Science of TC College Baramati, and I feel that each and every participant will be enjoying, will be enriching, and definitely will be mesmerizing with the resource persons. I am very much happy that such a type of seminars has to take place at each and every level of democratic freedom, and not only freedom but democratic responsibility which is bestowed on each other's shoulders. Dear friends, come together and let us be a responsible citizen, because we are obviously the pillars of Indian democracy. So never forget that yes, you are the ones who are the basic component of Indian democracy. So let us come together and learn more and more about the responsibilities and obviously about the friendships which are being provided by this great Indian nation. Wish you all the best. Jai Hind, Jai Maharashtra.
Thank you, sir. And now I call upon Dr. Hanuman Phatak, the HOD and Organizing Secretary of this webinar. I call upon him for the introductory speech. Thank you. Thank you, sir. And now I call upon Dr. Hanuman Phatak, the HOD and Organizing Secretary of this webinar. I call upon him for the introductory speech. Thank you.
Namaste. Hello, everyone, and welcome to this 3 days webinar on democracy in India. Before we begin this webinar, I would like to express my heartfelt gratitude to all of you who sincerely committed to this event to make it a success. It is my great pleasure to welcome everyone, that is all resource persons of this webinar, participants from every parts of the India, and some participants from the world. I also welcome to Dr. Chandrasekhar Murumkar sir, Principal, Tuljaram Chaturchand College Baramati, and Dr. Ajit Telve, Vice Principal and RUSA Coordinator, of this college. Department of Political Science established with an inception of the college in June 1962, and it runs UG and PG courses. The department has a legacy of eminent political thinkers, and several alumni have been heading prestigious positions in various social political uh, organizations and government. Moreover, the department has also runs in different add-on courses, including UGC approved certificate course in human rights. Department of Political Science is also known for various student-centric activities as well as research works carried out by faculty and published in national and international journals and books. As all of you are aware, democracy in India has been completed 75 years in the year 2022. This is a prophecy's time to map the trajectory of the democracy in India over the almost 75 years in the context of last 10 years and particularly after 2014. For this webinar, we have lot of eminent speakers like Dr. Mangesh Kulkarni, head of the department, Savitribai Phule Pune University, Pune. Mangesh Kulkarni will speak on whether Indian democracy. Dr. Suja Shakir sir, who is a head of the department, Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar, Marathwada University, Aurangabad. He will speak on majoritarian threats to liberal democracy. Dr. Harish Wankhede, who is a member of Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and he will speak on Dalit movement in India with special reference to Maharashtra. Dr. Sharad Baviskar, who is a faculty in Center for French and Franconian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi, and he will speak on Indian democracy, thinkability and reality. Dr. Chaitra Redkar, she will speak on changing discourses of rights in Indian democracy. Dr. Renu Roy, who is from Gwalior, Madhya Pradesh, and she will speak on constitutional governance of human rights in India. Dr. Bishwajit Prakash, Delhi University, he will speak on social democracy and economic transformation in India. Dr. Naushad Ali, he is from Calicut, Kerala, and he will speak on India's refugee policy with special reference to Rohingya crisis. Dr. Shiv Kumar, who is from Punjab, and he will speak on understanding new dynamics of India's foreign policy after 2014. Dr. Atriya Shah, she is from West Bengal, and she will speak on farmers' movement in India. Dr. Prashantu Vigay, he is from Amravati, Bharatiya Mahavidyalaya, and he will speak on leftist movement in India. Dr. Dattatreya Wabale, he is from Talegaon, and he will speak on constitutional institutions in India. Really, it is a glorious moment to extend my warm wishes on behalf of the Political Science Department of Tuljaram Chaturchanda College, Baramati. I want to convey my heartfelt gratitude to the management of Anekant Education Society, Principal Dr. Chandrasekhar Murumkar sir, all vice principals, teaching fraternity, and my colleagues for all kinds of support and motivation. Without their encouragement, it would have not possible. So thank you very much for being with us and hope that the intellectual deliberation will be fruitful. Thank you very much, and enjoy these 3 days. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. And now, for the keynote address, we have among us Dr. Suja Shakir, the HOD of Department of Political Science, Babasaheb Ambedkar, Marathwada University, Aurangabad. He has done his PhD on the role of governor in Indian polity with special reference to Maharashtra and Goa. He has published his research papers in several journals and magazines. He has also presented papers in national and international seminars and conferences. There are more than 50 papers. His forthcoming books are Postmodernism and Feminism in Political Theory, Sociological Roots of Agrarian Distress in Maharashtra. Presently, he is guiding 24 students for their MPhil and 7 students for PhD. Such is our guest for today's event. I welcome him on behalf of TC College. Over to you, sir. Thank you.
Who have given me an opportunity to address you and to, talk about a subject which is very close to my heart, and that is democracy in India and also democracy elsewhere, because democracy is a system which most countries have accepted as their political system. Most countries in the world are governed by democracy. That, of course, does not mean that democracy is similar everywhere. We get so many variations in democracy, not only structurally, but also in terms of governance and attitudes. We have adopted democracy in India after independence, and we have gone in for what we call parliamentary model of democracy. Now, no matter whether it is parliamentary democracy or presidential democracy or any other democracy, democracy basically is important because it is supposed to be a rule by the people, for the people, and of the people, which is a very old saying. The question before us today is whether this democracy is truly functioning in the spirit in which way it was imagined years ago, or whether we are facing challenges before the democracy and these challenges are ever growing. And when we ask this question, that is, regarding the challenges before the democracy, many come to mind, such as regionalism, language, communalism, corruption, criminalization of politics, and so on and so forth. See, democracy is a kind of free play for all. It gives lots and lots of freedom to everybody. To the individuals, to the government, to the institutions, and so on and so forth. But it's not actually free for all. It's not licensed to do whatever you want. Democracy, of course, comes with a lot of restrictions and a lot of expectations from its citizenry. And when we look at the challenges before the democracy today, we realize that somewhere all the important constituents of the democracy have not lived up to the expectations. So when we talk of challenges, when we talk of the questions before the democracy, when we talk hurdles in the way of democracy, we usually point to factors like regionalism, the problems of language, the problems of the different communities living together and not being able to cope with each other. Then there is a lot of corruption, then there is criminalization of politics, and so on and so forth. But are these the only challenges before the democracy? That is my question in this session. I think rather than being challenges, the factors such as regionalism, language, corruption, and so on and so forth are more of a symptom of the deeper ailment that afflicts the modern day democracy, whether in India or elsewhere. The real problem or the real malaise of democracy, as they say, I mean, of the global democracy, not only in India, but across Europe, America, and everywhere else, is what we understand as the deep-seated majoritarianism. The term is new. I mean, majoritarianism is being recently used to describe the kind of democracy that is obtaining across several countries. Now, what is this majoritarian democracy? Majoritarian democracy is a democracy, but it is something which is founded on two important pillars. One is the growth of far-right politics. Far-right politics. In Marathi, we call it Ati Uzveanta Rajkaran, far-right politics, and the emergence of populist leadership. Now, these are the two pillars that are, that can be seen as the foundation of this majoritarian democracy. On one hand, we have this growth of far-right politics, and on the other hand, there is growth of this populist leadership. Now, we should not confuse majoritarian democracy with democracy by majority voters. These are two different things, mind you. All liberal secular welfare democracies, including the Indian democracy, are supposed to produce a government formed by the consent of the majority voters. See, what I mean to say is, in every democracy, the government is produced when majority of the voters want that government. Majority of the voters want that government. When I say majority of the voters, when they want a government, they choose a government. I mean the majority of the voters scattered across the entire strata of the society. I hope you're getting my point. And in liberal democracy, majority does not mean majority constituted by single community, creed, caste, or religion. I mean, when we want a government in a liberal democracy, all voters, whether belonging to different castes, different religions, different groups, and so on and so forth, will vote for a particular government and choose it. Now here, single community, caste, creed, or or cultural group is not important. It is majority voters from all these groups that are important, and they are supposed to choose this government in a liberal democracy. But on the other hand, majoritarian democracy presumes majority to be constituted by people of one race, one religion, one color that effectively excludes those who do not belong to them, that is minorities. I mean, in liberal democracy, everybody comes forth, everybody joins the voting process and chooses a government irrespective of caste, creed, color, culture, and so on and so forth. But in majoritarian democracy, the appeal is to one factor, and that factor could be one religion, that factor could be one caste, one community, one cultural group, and so on and so forth. And if you create this kind of division in the democracy, then we clearly get the problem of majority and minority. Okay, see, for example, if I am a leader and I want to get elected, and I start appealing to my own group, say my caste group, my cultural group, my religious group, my linguistic group, whatever, and I get elected, that means that when I am appealing only to my constituency, to my set of voters, I am of course excluding the other set of voters. And these excluded people then become minorities, and herein comes the problem of majoritarian democracy. Having said that, let me also underline that the liberal welfare modern democracy can convert into majoritarian democracy if the conditions are right for that, if the conditions are suitable for that. And this can happen anytime, anywhere. And it's already happening across different countries in the world, which was why both Mill and Gandhi were skeptical of the representative democracy that could easily become majoritarian in their view, and that could also threaten into the bargain the minorities in the society. Therefore, both Mill and Gandhi were supposed to be the opponents of the so-called representative democracy. And I think their fear, the fear of both Gandhi and Mill, is being realized today. Okay, we'll come to that in a moment. So, having said that, I mean, having talked about the two important pillars of majoritarian democracy, that is far right politics and the growth of populism, let me begin with what is far right ideology. म्हणजे अति उजवे हे कोण आहेत आणि ते काय करतात. Okay, far right group or far right, yes, far right group, whether in our country or elsewhere, appear in form of party and movement that supports all kinds of fascist, racist, and reactionary ideas. In last 20 years or so, far right has successfully hijacked the liberal democracy. I mean, last 20 years, what has happened is that we have seen the growing consolidation of the far right groups within the democratic politics. Liberal welfare democracy is based on the principle of equality of opportunity and to some extent equality of outcome. So what are the hallmarks of a liberal democracy? Equality of opportunity and equality of outcome. This is something which is very critical to the democracy. Interestingly, the far right politics rejects both. I mean, both the ideas of equality of opportunity and the equality of outcome is outright rejected by these far right groups and far right politics because they believe there is basic inequality among all human beings. And some human beings are better than the other human beings. Far right ideologues, or the people who support the far right ideology, argue that there is nothing wrong if better become much better and the worst get worst. I mean, they don't see any problem with the inequality in the society. They say inequality is natural. They say if rich man is growing rich and the poor man is getting further poorer, what is wrong in that? Okay. So this is the kind of the approach which far right ideologues adopt. Now, where does this ideology of far right come into democracy from? Where does it? What is its breeding ground? There are certain, important areas we need to look at in order to understand how this far right politics germinates and how it starts taking the roots. The first is the religious fundamentalism. The first breeding ground for the far right to thrive is religious fundamentalism. Second, which is closely followed, which is implied in the religious fundamentalism, is the prejudice against minorities. Third is, of course, anti-rationalism. Fourth is pro-nationalism or extreme form of nationalism. Fifth is opposition to civil rights and women's special rights. They are opposed to the rights of women. They are opposed to the rights of minorities. They are opposed to the rights of all vulnerable segments of the society. Sixth is promoting centralized power and one-party state. This far right is characterized by their hatred for the multi-party system. They do not want many parties to participate. They want just one party and they want almost no opposition. So their attack is so aggressive, their attack is so profound against the opposition that they want the entire opposition groups to be exterminated. Okay, and they want only one party in the entire state to be ruling it, to be deciding its future. Okay, so this hatred for for opposition is a special characteristic of this far right ideology. Now, these six grounds tell us that how this far right ideology germinates in the society and how they take hold. Now, we have seen over years, since 1990s in particular, there has been a rise, upsurge in what we call the religious fundamentalism across the world. Religion suddenly became very important. You can call it a byproduct of globalization, liberalization, and so on and so forth. That the religion became an important part of politics. And slowly, from religion, it goes to racism, it goes to bigotry, it goes to fundamentalism. See, when you bring religion into politics, it is not far that it is going to be fundamentalist kind of approach. Okay, so this has happened, and because of this, all other factors have come into play. Now, while we talk about this far-right politics in democracy, some people make comparison of these far-right groups with Nazis. They say there is no difference between Nazis and these far-right groups. On the face of it, of course, there is very little difference, between these two. We cannot distinguish them that easily because the ideology of Nazi and the ideology of the far right come very close. But there is one critical difference. And that difference is, while Nazis want full-fledged dictatorial state and they absolutely hate democracy, far right operates within democracy and seeks power through democratic means, only to subvert the democratic governance in the gradual way. See, Nazis are outright opponents of democracy. They have nothing to do with democracy. Far right is a bit different. The far right group wants democracy. It wants to capture the power through democracy and then finish the democracy. That is how the difference between these two comes up. Okay. I'm reminded of Levitsky and Ziblatt. Okay, these are the two professors of Harvard University who have written a very interesting book called How Democracies Die. And this subject has been dealt with by them in a very minute detail. And they argue that the threat to the democracy is not from outside. The threat to democracy is not from the dictators. The threat to democracy lies within, from its own people who have come to power through democratic means, but want now to subvert the democracy altogether. This is the basic argument of Levitsky and Ziblatt in their book, How Democracies Die. Now, coming back to the far-right politics and far-right political parties, there are certain interesting aspects to their approach. Von Beami says one very important and interesting thing about these far-right people. He says that we know who the far-right people are, but we do not know what actually they are. This is the dilemma. Okay. Unlike other parties or other groups, the identity of far-right groups is often very individualistic. And they are not interested in becoming a part of any group. I mean, these far-right groups do not want to share anything with the other groups, even if the other groups have similar sort of ideology as theirs. Now, this is very interesting. Even if the other groups follow the same ideology, still, the far-right groups do not want to share anything with them. Means they want to be alone, they want to be individualistic. This is the very important characteristic of the far-right politics, underlined by Von Beami. Now, this characteristic is in stark contrast, is very different from the other groups. For example, take the left parties. There are different left parties. I mean, left is, so many left parties. There is such a huge diversity among the leftists also. But all leftists tend to agree on the basic principles of left. They agree on some basic principles. They also can go together, okay, in certain circumstances. But this is not the case, remember, with the far-right groups. Okay, so this is one very important aspect which need to be understood in order to understand what they are doing to democracy. Now the question, how did this far-right politics suddenly become popular within the global democracies? Now, we have had a successive, run of liberal and welfare democracy for such a long period. Then suddenly we realize that there is the emergence of these far-right groups who are taking over and who are converting democracy into majoritarian democracy. The question is, why are people supporting the far-right groups in the society? In 2017, Audrey Sheehy wrote a very interesting essay in the Harvard Political Review, and the title of the essay was The Rise of the Far Right. Okay, Rise of the Far Right. Okay. Now, Sheehy says that it is basically the economic insecurity which creates the favorable environment for the far-right parties. for which reason anybody who is economically insecure may be considered as the silent supporter of the far right. This, we usually ask the question, if far right people are so bad, if they are so dangerous to democracy, why are we supporting them? Sheehy answers this question and says that people support far right groups because there is so much of economic insecurity in the society. Economic insecurity began to hit Europe after 2009. Several countries, including Greece, Cyprus, Spain, Portugal, Italy, and Ireland, saw their debts piling up and the welfare system not working properly. This was what was discovered in 2009. And because of this, working and middle class people in Europe faced unemployment, salary cuts, denial to welfare access, pensions, and access to healthcare. When you start losing out on these issues, naturally you feel that the people whom you have elected are not doing enough for you and you need a change. Okay, Sheehy makes an important point about why far right is becoming popular this way. He says that far right is succeeding because it can pose itself as more liberal than the so-called liberals and more open in its economic ideas than the traditional left. And the people were impressed by this argument. So this is their strategy. They show they are more liberal than the liberals, and they also show they are more leftist than the left. And people believe them. People believe them because people are mired in that kind of economic insecurity. They have lost their jobs, they have lost their pensions, they have lost their access to healthcare. And in such circumstances, anybody giving even a false hope becomes important. So that is how this far right has become important in Europe. And I think that is one of the reasons why far right has become important in Asia and countries like ours. Now, if we accept Sheehy's argument that it is economic insecurities that create attraction for the far right, then almost all modern democracies appear to provide a befitting environment for the far right, given the widespread growth in the economic inequalities. Everywhere in the world, you take any country, we see, huge inequalities. So much inequality that, what was the name of that French thinker who has been awarded Nobel Prize for his work on capital? Okay, I'm not forgetting the name. He says that in last 50 years, we have seen growth in economic inequality, something that we have not seen in last 100 to 100 years. Means in last 50 years, there has been such an upsurge in the economic inequalities and other kinds of inequalities in the world that democracy has indeed come under threat just because of this. According to Oxfam report of 2019, high levels of inequality is evident at the global level. We can see it being evident at the global level, considering the fact that income of 380 crore people fell by 11% in 2018. On the other hand, means 380 crore people lost their income by 11%. And at the same time, 1 billionaire was created every 2 days. After every 2 days, we got 1 billionaire, and increasingly, on the other hand, 380 crore people lost their income as much as by 11%. In India, to take the example from home, in India, wealth of top 1% increased by 39%, whereas the bottom 50%, wealth of bottom 50% increased by merely 3%. Means if 1% rich can earn 39%, okay, at the same time, 1% rich were earning 39%, and they saw growth of their wealth by 39%. The same time, the bottom 50% found their growth only rising by 3%. So this huge gap between these two. This is just an example from what was happening 2 years ago. According to a UN report, now another aspect of inequality. According to UN report, globally, women earn 23% less than men. And in India, women are still receiving 30% less wages than their male counterparts for the similar kind of work. Men and women working in similar way, in similar area, and doing similar job, still women are getting 34% less than men. If this is the level of inequality in our country, imagine what is happening across much poorer countries than ours. And we say we are very happy with the kind of democracy we are having because it is giving us freedom and all those kinds of things. So what kind of freedom is this? I mean, on one hand, we keep talking of freedom and democracy as its basic hallmark. On the other hand, we see the rise in these upsurge of inequalities in almost all segments of the society. So can we think that democracy will survive this way? Can we think democracy, I mean, some didactic thing like freedom, freedom, and freedom will help us overcome this difficulty which we are facing in the sphere of economy? I don't think. And because of these factors, I mean, when there is huge upsurge in the economy, we want to look for alternatives. We no more have faith in our political leadership. We want change. And in that change, we can close our eyes and vote blindly. And that is what is happening. And we are voting exactly for the kind of people who are not good for the democracy, thinking that these people the good people have not delivered. Let us bring in bad people and see what they can do for us. So that is how this far right has grown. Now, continuing that thing, India has added 18 new billionaires in just last year. In 1 year, India has added 18 new billionaires. Okay, taking the total number of billionaires in the country to 119. And the total wealth of the billionaires in India is higher than the union budget for 2018 and 19. If you combine the wealth of these billionaires in the country, you will find that that wealth is larger. Okay, that wealth is higher than the entire budget of this country for 2018 and 19. It was something like 20,42,000 crores or something like that. That was the budget. And the total wealth of these billionaires exceeds that amount. The country's combined revenue and capital expenditure of center and state, means the total expenditure made, okay, revenue as well as capital expenditure made by both center and state for public health, for sanitation and water supply, and the amount required for that, I mean, when the state government and the central government, okay, they both make their revenue and capital expenditure on public health, sanitation and water supply, they require huge amount of money. But this huge amount of money is still less than the wealth of Mukesh Ambani. Imagine this thing. And Mukesh Ambani's wealth is more than the entire revenue and capital expenditure of both center and the state governments of the country of India for public health, sanitation and water supply. Imagine the kind of wealth that one man has. So I'm not here speaking against Ambani. I have got nothing to do with him. What I'm saying is, if one person can own this much amount of wealth, can there be equality in the society in the real sense of the term? Can we really go on talking of freedom as the hallmark of democracy, as the necessity of the democracy, and as the final condition in which we will be happy? No, we cannot. See, far right thrives on shaming this liberal elite, blaming it for corruption and its inability to resolve economic hardships of the people. And to add to this, far right people will never speak against the inequalities. They will never do again anything to reduce the inequalities in the society. In fact, if at all they will do anything, it will be to promote this inequality in the society. It will be to promote the kind of capitalists who are amassing huge amounts of wealth, because these capitalists then become their supporters and the link is established for their further stay in power. I'll come to that later. But then before coming to that, I want to talk of populism. What is this populism? Marathi मध्ये आपण पॉप्युलिझमला लोकप्रियता असं म्हणतो. What is this populism? And is this populism something new to democracy? Let us see that. When the far right politics gets strong, it produces populism. It produces populist leadership. Populism is a special quality of the far right leader to strengthen its extreme ideology. And together they constitute a solid pillar of majoritarian democracy, as I have already told you. So what is populism all about? Let me put it in highlights. First, populists want to make democracy authoritarian by projecting a strong leadership. They promote the idea that majority is always right, no matter what. Majority is always right. Even if majority kills the people, it is right because it is majority. It has power, it has authority to do so. It has license to enjoy its power. So majority is always right. 3, populist leadership wants to encourage vigilantism in public life and social media. I mean, they want to control the information in public life as well as in social media, because they know if any wrong information about them goes in the society and people come to know it, the people can oppose them, the people can go against them. So therefore, they want a doctored kind of information to go in the society. And society, how do we get the information in the society? Through media, through print media, through electronic media, and through social media. These are the 3 important tools of disseminating information in the society. And the far right, populist leadership wants to control all these 3 media. This is their characteristic. And they use, finally, 4th point, they use the hate speech that emboldens the vigilante groups to attack the minorities. Okay. Now, if you look at these 4 things, you will find there are several democratic countries across the world where you have this kind of leadership in play. Okay. Levitsky and Ziblatt, again coming back to their book, How Democracies Die, highlight the signs to know to identify a populist leader, how a populist leader turns into an authoritarian ruler. Okay, again, going back to Ziblatt, Levitsky and Ziblatt, and this is given for your reference, this is given on page 21 of their book. Levitsky and Ziblatt say that populist leader rejects the democratic rules of the game. Very important point. Number 1, populist leader does not want to go by the democratic rules of the game. See, in democracy, there are certain rules by which leader has to go, and these rules come from the constitution of the country. But a populist leader, when elected to power, will try to bypass these democratic rules of the game. One thing. Second, Levitsky and Ziblatt further say, okay, this populist leadership denies the legitimacy of opponents. Means they say that opposition is bad. They cannot do anything. They are good for nothing. So don't think about them. I mean, opposition la, विरोधींना पूर्णतः बदनाम करणे, हे सांगणे की विरोधी काहीच कामाचे नाहीये, त्यांना काही जमतच नाही. विरोधी पक्ष जे आहे ते जे आहे ते त्यांचं महत्व संपलेलं आहे. Opposition has become irrelevant. Opposition has become weak. Opposition has become useless. This narrative is so much thrust upon the society, on the minds of the people, that people also start believing that there is no other alternative except this popular leader. We don't have anybody in opposition. Everybody is like dead. Okay. So this is point number 2, which Levitsky and Ziblatt make in their book, How Democracies Die. They say the populist leadership will deny the legitimacy of the opponents. The third, populist leadership will easily tolerate the violence in the society and at times will also encourage it. I mean, what does this populist leadership do? They tolerate the violence in the society. If a violent incident takes place in the society, they just close their eyes or keep mum about it. They don't say a word about it, whether it is good or bad. Okay? That way they encourage that kind of violence. Okay. Fourth, populist leadership will cut the civil liberties of the opponents. Whosoever they think is their opponent, they will attack him, they will cut down on his liberty, they will file false cases against him, they will jail him, they will arrest him without evidence and do all kinds of bad things to him, who they think is their opponent. Okay? They will send the government agencies to investigate him and so on and so forth. So this is a ready tool of the populist leadership, that they will try to target the opposition in whatever manner they can, even using the government machinery. Okay. Fifth, Levitsky and Ziblatt further say that populist leadership will try to control all the democratic institutions. See, democracy works by its institution. What is democracy? Why is democracy important? And what is the most important part of democracy? The most important and integral part of the democracy is the institution in the democracy. Now, we have so many institutions in the democracy, and these institutions are supposed to work independently without being under the control of the government directly. I mean, take judiciary. Judiciary is an important institute in the country. If the judiciary starts working under the direction of the government, then imagine what will happen in the society. Okay, take election commission. Election commission is another institution in the society of importance. If the election commission starts following the dictates of the government, what will happen? We are not going to have free and fair elections then. So what this populist leadership tries to do is something very, very dangerous. They try to control the democratic institutions. There are ways to control the democratic institutions. I'll not go into the detail. You are all sensible enough to understand how it happens. So suffice it to say here that a important feature of populist leadership is trying to control the democratic institutions. And finally, populist leadership will invariably try to control the media in the country. They will control all kinds of media. I mean, they will try to control the print media, they will try to control the electronic media, and they will also try to control the social media. Again, there are mechanisms and the ways to do it. Ways are not very good, but then whatever, they are there. And most popular leadership employs those techniques, uses those kinds of ways to do all these things. Again, I will not go into the details. You can understand how it happens. So these are the 6 important highlights which Levitsky and Ziblatt have given in their book, How Democracies Die. And they are very important. And they say this is not restricted to one or any other leadership, individual leadership across the globe. It is applicable to all populist leaderships which we are witnessing nowadays. Okay. I now come to an important study apart from Levitsky and Ziblatt. I also want to talk about Yascha Mounk and Jordan Kyle. Okay, these are the 2 investigators, 2 writers who have studied what populism does to democracy. Okay, how democracy comes under threat when there is populism. And Yascha Mounk and Jordan Kyle's study in this context is worth referring to. I will very briefly go through this and then we'll come to the another point of this presentation. In 2018, this study was done in 2018 by Yascha Mounk and Jordan Kyle. And the authors say that populist leadership deepens corruption, erode individual rights, and damages the democratic institutions. Means, according to this study of Yascha Mounk and Jordan Kyle, populist leadership in democracy does 3 important things. They deepen corruption, the society becomes more corrupt. They erode, they finish off the individual rights, at least try to do that. And then they irreparably damage the democratic institutions. These 3 things are very dangerous things, you can imagine. The authors here point that between 1990 and 2008, there were 46 populist leaders who ruled in 33 democracies. Of these, 14 are still in power. Okay, between 1990 and 2018. There were 46 populist leaders in 33 democracies. Of them, 30%, I mean 14 are still in power. And an important point about this populist leadership is they do not want to leave power. They want to stay in power by whatever means they can, good or bad, by hook or crook, as they say. Because between this 1990 and 2018, 23% of the populist leaders were forced to be kicked out or to resign. They were forced, in fact, forced by the people, forced by the system, forced by the by the anger of the people, in fact, to resign or to be impeached or to go home as they were. Okay, they did not want to lose power. So an important hallmark again of the populist leadership, they do not want to lose power. Okay, once a populist leader comes into power, it is very, very difficult, okay, to remove him from the power. He will just bypass all the democratic means. He will do whatever to stay in power, and he can become very dangerous in those circumstances. Yascha Mounk and Jordan Kyle focus on 4 models of populist democracy. They talk of the 4 models of the populist democracy in the country. They talk of Modi's India, they talk of Trump's USA, Widodo's Indonesia, and Bolsonaro's Brazil. Okay, so these four leaderships, they say, show that authoritarian, that populist tendencies in democracy. And their conclusion is startling. A populist leader is more likely to continue in power for a decade. They say once a populist leader is elected, he is most likely to get re-elected. Means he will create such situations in the society that people will re-elect him. That is what the authors conclude. After 5 years in power, their chances are twice as likely as non-populist leader to get elected. Okay, means once they stay in power for 5-6 years, whatever it is they are more likely, there are double chances that they will get re-elected as compared to a non-populist leader. So this is very dangerous. Okay, and if they stay for more than 10 years, there are 5 times more chances that they will stay for further more 10 years. This is what authors have concluded. I don't know to what extent we can believe in this. Okay, but on the face of it, it appears that the populist leadership is the kind of leadership that will entrench itself into the power in such a way that it will be impossible to remove him, whether by democratic means or otherwise. Okay. Now, what populist leaders have done to democracy? Authors say that they rewrote the rules of the game to tilt the playing field in their favor. Means somehow they turn and twist the rules in such a way that all game comes in their favor. All democratic game automatically turns in their favor. An astounding 50% populist under the study amended constitution to weaken the checks and balances system on executive authority. So what these 50% populists have done since 1990, the authors say that they have changed the constitution. They have amended the constitution to weaken the system of checks and balances. They do not want the checks and balances. Checks and balances is a system of control on executive, we know, in parliamentary democracy. And this system has to be there. It must be working system. Otherwise, we will get an authoritarian leadership. Otherwise, democracy will become a dictatorship. So therefore, every democratic constitution in liberal democracy provides for the system of checks and balances. What this populist leadership has done in last 50 years, in last 20-25 years, 50% of these leaders, I mean, imagine, it's a huge number. 50% of the populist leaders have deliberately amended democracy amended the constitution in order to weaken this system of checks and balances. So imagine where we are heading for. Imagine what is becoming of democracy and what lies ahead. Authors found that under populist rule, wherever they ruled, the country saw 7% decline in freedom of press. Means wherever this populist leadership ruled, there was decline of 7% in the freedom of press, 8% decline in civil liberties, and 13% decline in political rights. I mean, see what they have done to democracy. People say that democracy is a very strong system. It will not allow the populist leadership to do whatever they like. But this is not true. Democracy as a system might be strong, constitution might be very strong, but these people are cunning enough, okay, to change it in such a manner that it suits them. It suits what they have in mind. It suits their attitude. Now, what these people have done is, wherever they have ruled, this populist leadership, they have reduced the freedom of press, they have reduced the civil liberties of the citizens, and they have reduced the political rights of the citizens. And they have successfully done that. Authors here clearly show, giving the percentages. Okay, and this study, I think, is very important. And this is an eye-opener for all those who think that democracy is strong no matter who comes to power. Wrong. Democracy is not strong to withstand each and every person, each and every kind of group in the society. There are groups in the society which could be a very dangerous threat to the democracy. And these groups are acquiring power in modern day democracy. Hence this session, hence this presentation. Why majoritarian democracy is dangerous. Now, to conclude, I might say that populist leaders threaten minorities and silently allow violence against them. We see there have been incidents of mob lynching in India. I mean, mob lynching of various kinds of minorities taking place. Business Standard, which is you cannot say it's anti-government. It's more or less a pro-government paper, pro-government magazine in India. In its issue dated June 29, 2017, writes that between 2010 and 2017, 63 incidents of mob lynching were reported that left 28 dead and 124 people injured. The 28 dead included 24 members of Muslim minorities. 97 of these mob violence took place, 97% of these mob violence, acts of mob violence took place after 2014. I mean, if you look at this populism, one of the tools of this populism to consolidate itself in power is to spread the hatred about minorities, is to castigate the minorities. And we are seeing the result. And this is not just about India I am speaking. Please don't think I'm referring specifically to India. It has happened everywhere. You take the example of United States under Trump. You take the example of Turkey under Erdogan. You take the example of Putin's Russia and Bolsonaro's Brazil. Okay, everywhere you get a similar kind of pattern where there is rise of far-right politics, where the religious fundamentalism has been somehow brought into the politics, where there is emergence of this populist leadership, and where there is suffering by the minorities. So this pattern obtains everywhere, wherever there is a rise in the populist leadership. The populist leadership, interestingly, shows itself to be the supporter of poor, but under its rule, it is the crony capitalists who thrive. This is the basic difference between capitalists and the crony capitalists. Capitalists are the people whom we know, I mean, who are the rich people, who are the entrepreneurs, whatever. Okay. Who despite being rich, despite being everything else, okay, want to follow the rules of the game, okay, are democratic in their outlook, are liberal in their approach. This is supposed to be the idea about the capitalists, the generally what we call as capitalists across Europe, America, or in India. But crony capitalists are different from them. The crony capitalists are the ones who will fund this kind of populist leadership, who will pay huge amounts of money to the populist leadership, to the far-right groups, in order to thrive in the business, in order to do, to excel the others, in order to be good businessmen. I mean, it's a kind of bribery. Okay, it's a kind of bribery that you have friends in political circles, you pay them and you get your things done. Okay, you get licenses, you get special permissions to do certain things, and you get all kinds of benefits from them. When you do this kind of thing, I mean, selectively helping the people in power, especially the populist groups, far-right groups and the populist leadership, in order to get your things done, you become a crony capitalist. And the tribe of crony capitalists almost always invariably increases whenever there is rise in the populist leadership in a country. Okay, this crony capitalists will thrive, will become richer, will get all kinds of businesses, okay, and so on and so forth. So who benefits from this far right and this populist leadership? It is the crony capitalists. Crony capitalists are everywhere. They're in America, they're in Europe, they're in India. We need not name them. You are intelligent enough to know who they are. This is what this far right and politics of far right and the growth of populism does in the society. That is, they tell poor that they are their supporters. They tell farmers that they are their supporters. I mean, only they who are going to help them. But in reality, they end up helping these crony capitalists. Okay? And they have certain tools in their hands. And one of the tools that I have just mentioned is the media. Okay? People mostly see in countries like Asia, Africa, Latin America, there's still a lot of ignorance among the people. The illiteracy levels are still very high. Okay? And people do not understand what is going on. See, one of the conditions of a successful democracy is awareness among the people. And that is precisely what we are lacking in countries like ours and other poor countries like in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. That is unfortunate, but that is true. Okay, people do not understand what is happening. They readily buy the argument, they readily buy the stuff, they readily buy the narrative that is shown on the TV, and they go by it. And we know this how adept are these far right groups, the far right politicians, the far right leadership is in controlling the media. Okay, so this is in my opinion, one of the biggest challenges before the modern day democracy, whether in India or elsewhere, that we are faced with this emergence of the far right politics and growth of this far right politics and the emergence of this populist leadership. How far this will go, nobody can, only time will tell. Okay, what impact will it have on the society? Certainly a very bad impact, because even if the far right groups go out of power, they leave behind their legacy. Okay, so democracy is certainly, not going through one of its best phases. Okay, I don't know how democracy will cure itself out of this, but one thing is certain: lack of awareness among the people, among the citizenry, among the voters is one of the important causes for the rise of this majoritarian democracy. And unless people themselves understand what is to be done in order to preserve this precious democracy which we have got after years of struggle, years of nationalist movement, only then I think some solution can come out. I once again thank the organizers for giving me this opportunity to talk of a subject which has somehow become my favorite subject in the recent times. So thank you very much, and hope to see you very soon. Thank you.
Hello everyone, and with this we come to the end of the first session, and now it's time to propose the vote of thanks. Firstly, I take this opportunity to thank our principal, Dr. Chandrasekhar Murumkar, for his welcome address. I also thank Dr. Hanuman Phatak, who is the organizing secretary and HOD of the Department of Political Science, TC College, Baramati. And I take this opportunity to thank Dr. Suja Shakir, who delivered the keynote address. He spoke on majoritarian threats to liberal democracy. It was indeed a thought-provoking lecture. Thank you very much, sir. And with this, I declare the end of the first session. Thank you very much.